The word taboo exists in almost every language on Earth. We use it to describe things that are forbidden, shameful, things polite society refuses to talk about. What most people do not know is where that word actually comes from. It comes from the Polynesian word tapua, and tapua translates directly to one thing: menstruation. The most universal word for forbidden in human language was literally invented to describe a woman's period. For most of recorded history, half the population experienced something every single month that the other half refused to acknowledge. Doctors debated whether women should be allowed to manage it. Religious texts called them unclean. A Roman naturalist once claimed that a menstruating woman could kill crops just by walking past them. What nobody talks about is what women actually used. Because for thousands of years before the modern tampon showed up in the 1930s, they were improvising with everything from softened tree bark to sheep's wool to folded paper held in place with string. And the story of how we got from papyrus to Tampax involves battlefield nurses, a rejected patent, a moral panic over virginity, and a corporate disaster that killed 73 women. This is the history nobody wanted to write down. And that silence is exactly why it matters. Ancient Egypt, roughly 1500 BCE. The Nile Delta stretched green and wide, and papyrus reeds grew thick along the riverbanks. Egyptians used papyrus for almost everything. They made paper from it, wove baskets, built sandals, even fashioned rope. And according to the oldest surviving records of menstrual management in human history, Egyptian women softened strips of papyrus and shaped them into something that functioned like an early tampon. That might sound uncomfortable, and honestly, it probably was. Papyrus is not exactly known for its absorbency, but Egyptian culture treated menstruation differently than most of the civilizations that came after. They associated it with the goddess Hathor, who was considered the protector of women and fertility. Some ancient Egyptian medical texts even describe menstrual blood as an ingredient in healing ointments and potions. In a world that would spend the next several thousand years treating periods as a curse, the Egyptians saw them as something closer to sacred. Across the Mediterranean, the ancient Greeks had their own approach. Women used scraps of linen or homemade rags, but some historians point to a more inventive solution. Greek women reportedly wrapped small pieces of lint around lightweight wooden sticks to create an insertable device they called a motos. Now, there is some academic debate about whether these were actually used for menstruation or as a form of early contraception. The answer might be both. Either way, the Greeks were fashioning DIY internal devices out of wood and fabric over 2,000 years ago. The Greeks also had some truly wild beliefs about what happened when menstruation went wrong. They believed that if a young woman's first period arrived late, the blood would accumulate around her heart, and her uterus would start wandering through her body, causing erratic behavior, violent mood swings, even suicidal thoughts. This theory had a name. They called the condition hysteria, from the Greek word hystera, meaning uterus. That word stuck around for centuries. All the way into the 20th century, doctors were still diagnosing women with hysteria for basically any behavior men found inconvenient. Meanwhile, in Rome, women made pads from woven cotton and wool. Some historians suggest Roman women also created internal tampons from tightly rolled sheep's wool. Wool was a smart choice, actually. It is naturally absorbent, antimicrobial, and widely available across the Roman Empire. The product worked. The culture around it did not. Because Rome also gave us Pliny the Elder, a naturalist and author who died in 79 CE, and who devoted an alarming number of pages in his Encyclopedia Natural History to describing what menstrual blood could supposedly do. According to Pliny, a menstruating woman could turn new wine sour just by being near it. She could make bees abandon their hives. She could dull the edge of a razor, kill plants, and cause caterpillars to fall dead from the ears of corn. He even claimed that if a dog tasted menstrual blood, it would go permanently insane. And no, he was not joking. This was considered serious science. Pliny was one of the most respected intellectuals in Roman society, and his writings influenced European thought for over 1,000 years. This was the same man who also believed that drinking the blood of a gladiator could cure epilepsy, so maybe consider the source. Farther east, ancient Japanese women used folded paper to absorb menstrual flow, held in place with a bandage or cloth tie. Across the Pacific, Native American women developed their own solutions from whatever the land provided. Some communities used pads made from moss, which is naturally absorbent and carries mild antibacterial properties. Others used buffalo skin. Some indigenous communities built dedicated lodges where menstruating women could gather together, squatting over absorbent grass mats laid across the floor. These spaces were not always punitive. In some cultures, they were treated as places of rest, reflection, even spiritual renewal. The idea that menstrual seclusion was always about shame is a later projection, not a universal truth. Here is the frustrating part for historians trying to piece all of this together. Almost every material women used, the papyrus, the wool, the moss, the linen, the paper, was organic. It decomposed. It left almost no trace in the archaeological record. The reason we know so little about how women managed menstruation for most of human history is not because it did not happen. It is because the products disappeared, and the men who wrote the history books did not consider it worth mentioning. The women figured it out. They always did. Using whatever was available, in whatever culture they lived in, they found a way to manage something their bodies did every single month, often without any help, acknowledgement, or even basic sympathy from the societies they lived in. That creativity would continue for centuries. Through the medieval period, through the Industrial Revolution, through 2 world wars. But it would take a battlefield innovation and a rejected patent before anyone thought to actually build a product for them. If Pliny the Elder's wild claims about menstrual blood had been some fringe opinion from one eccentric Roman, the damage would have been limited. But Pliny was not an outlier. He was the mainstream, and the ideas he helped popularize did not die with Rome. They migrated straight into the religious texts and cultural norms that would shape the next 1,500 years of Western civilization. The Book of Leviticus in the Hebrew Bible states it plainly. A menstruating woman is considered unclean for 7 days. Anyone who touches her becomes unclean until evening. Anything she sits on, anything she lies on, is contaminated. If a man has contact with her during her period, he too is considered impure for a full week. The Torah echoes the same passage almost word for word. The Quran instructs men to keep away from wives during menstruation. And across medieval Christendom, church authorities used these passages as justification for excluding menstruating women from communion, from entering churches, sometimes from leaving their homes entirely. This was not subtle. This was institutional. Across multiple religions, on multiple continents, for over 1,000 years, the message was the same. A woman on her period was spiritually contaminated. In some Hindu communities, that belief took physical form through a tradition called chowpadi. During menstruation, women were removed from the family home and sent to live in a small hut on the outskirts of the village. These structures were often poorly ventilated, unheated, and exposed to the elements. Women were forbidden from touching other people, from entering the kitchen, from participating in religious ceremonies. The practice was formally criminalized in Nepal in 2005, and again with stronger penalties in 2017. It still happens. Women have died in these huts from snake bites, smoke inhalation, and exposure to cold. In the 21st century, back in medieval Europe, the situation was less extreme, but no less bleak. Most women did not have access to any kind of purpose-made menstrual product. They used whatever scraps of fabric they could find, linen rags, old cloth, sometimes just layers of undergarments. Many women simply bled into their clothing and wore heavy layered skirts to conceal it. If you have ever heard the phrase "on the rag," that is exactly where it comes from. It was literal. Women were on the rag because the rag was all they had. Washing and reusing these rags was common practice, But even that came with stigma. Menstrual cloths had to be cleaned discreetly, dried out of sight, hidden from the men of the household. The process of managing a period in medieval Europe was not just physically uncomfortable, it was a monthly exercise in secrecy. Women were expected to bleed, clean up, and never let anyone know it was happening, and the myths kept compounding. In parts of medieval France, it was believed that menstrual blood could curdle cheese. In Russia, Orthodox Christianity held that a menstruating woman could repel fish and corrupt the minds of young hunters. In parts of Eastern Europe, a menstruating woman was thought to be capable of killing plants just by looking at them. These were not jokes told in taverns. These were beliefs woven into legal codes, agricultural customs, and daily religious practice. The ancient Greeks had given the world the word hysteria to describe any female behavior that men found confusing. That word entered the medical vocabulary and stayed there. By the medieval period, any woman who acted erratically, spoke too loudly, expressed anger, or challenged authority could be diagnosed as hysterical. The connection to the uterus was explicit. The cure often involved forced rest, isolation, or worse. The shame around menstruation was not just cultural. It had become medical doctrine. Most people never heard about one critical detail from this era. Throughout the medieval and early modern period, the only people with the education and platform to write about the human body were men. Monks, priests, physicians, scholars. They wrote about war, they wrote about philosophy, they wrote about disease. They almost never wrote about menstruation, and when they did, it was to describe it as dangerous, polluting, or spiritually corrupt. The result was a historical blind spot so complete that even today, researchers trying to reconstruct how women managed their periods before the 19th century are mostly working from fragments, guesses, and oral histories passed down through communities that the written record ignored entirely. By the 1800s, attitudes had shifted just enough for a new kind of conversation to begin. Not because society suddenly became enlightened about menstruation. That would take another century and a half. But because industrialization was creating new materials, new manufacturing methods, and new consumer markets. And in 1854, the first patent for a menstrual belt was filed in the United States. The commercial period industry, clumsy and awkward, and still wrapped in shame, was about to be born. It would take a world war to make it work. In 1914, Kimberly-Clark was a conservative paper company based in Neenah, Wisconsin. They made newsprint, they made wrapping paper, and they were not in the business of thinking about menstruation. But the company had recently developed a new material called cellucotton, a creped cellulose wadding made from processed wood pulp. It was 5 times more absorbent than cotton. It cost about half as much to produce. And when the United States entered World War I, Kimberly-Clark offered to supply cellucotton to the War Department at cost. No markup, no profit margin, just bandages for soldiers. Cellucotton worked brilliantly for wound care. It soaked up blood faster and more efficiently than anything the military had used before, and field hospitals across France and Belgium went through enormous quantities of it. But the nurses stationed in those hospitals noticed something else. The same material that stopped a shrapnel wound from bleeding out also worked for a completely different kind of bleeding, one that nobody in the military had planned for. Nurses on the Western Front started using cellucotton surgical dressings as makeshift menstrual pads. They did not ask permission. They did not submit a request through the chain of command. They just did it, quietly, practically, the same way women had been solving this problem for thousands of years. Except this time, the material actually worked well. After the armistice in 1918, Kimberly-Clark faced a very practical problem. The war was over. The government no longer needed millions of bandages. The company was sitting on a surplus of cellucotton with no obvious buyer. That is when letters from the American Fund for the French Wounded started arriving at company headquarters. Army nurses were writing in to say that they had been using the surgical dressings for menstrual management and that it worked better than anything they had ever tried. Kimberly-Clark saw a market. In 1920, the company launched Kotex, the first mass-marketed disposable sanitary pad in American history. The name came from cotton texture, abbreviated to cotangent tex by an employee, then respelled for the product label. The pads were rectangular, made from about 40 plies of cellucotton, wrapped in gauze and held in place by a belt worn around the waist. They were bulky, they were not particularly comfortable, and they were a genuine revolution. Before Kotex, the options for American and European women had not changed much since the Middle Ages. Reusable cloth rags, folded fabric, layers of undergarments. Kotex offered something that had never existed at scale before, a disposable product designed specifically for menstruation that a woman could use once and throw away. Selling it was another problem entirely. Magazines and newspapers did not want to run advertisements for menstrual products. The subject was considered too vulgar for print. Kimberly-Clark's first marketing agency eventually convinced a handful of publications to accept Kotex ads in 1921. But the language had to be so euphemistic that readers could barely figure out what the product was for. The ads talked about sanitary protection and personal hygiene without ever mentioning menstruation, periods, or blood. The copy read like it was trying to describe something without actually describing it, because that is exactly what it was doing. Retailers had their own objections. Store clerks, most of them men, were uncomfortable with women asking to buy menstrual pads over the counter. So Kimberly-Clark and its retail partners came up with a workaround that says everything about how deeply this shame ran. They placed Kotex boxes on store counters with a small slot and a coin deposit. A woman could walk into a store, drop her money into the box, take the product, and leave without ever speaking to another human being. Think about that for a second. A medical product used by roughly half the adult population had to be sold through a system specifically designed so that nobody would have to say what it was out loud. Kotex sold. Slowly at first, picking up real momentum by 1926. Other companies took notice. Johnson & Johnson had actually tried to sell a disposable menstrual pad called Lister's Towels back in 1888, but the product flopped because nobody would advertise it and nobody would talk about it. Kotex succeeded where Lister's Towels failed, partly because the war had normalized disposability as a concept, and partly because Kimberly-Clark was willing to push through the advertising barrier, even if pushing through meant never saying the word menstruation in any ad they ran. By the late 1920s, the disposable pad market was growing. Women finally had a commercially available product that was designed for them. But pads still had serious limitations. They were thick, they required a belt, they restricted movement, and for women who were physically active, whether they were factory workers, dancers, or athletes, pads were not enough. Someone was about to solve that problem. A doctor in Denver had been watching his wife struggle with the same rags and bulky pads that women had been dealing with for centuries. And he had an idea that every major company in America would reject. Dr. Earl Cleveland Haas was not a famous physician. He was an osteopathic doctor who had graduated from the Kansas City College of Osteopathy in 1918, spent a decade working as a country general practitioner in rural Colorado, and eventually settled in Denver in 1928. He sold real estate on the side. He ran a small company that manufactured antiseptics. He had already invented a flexible ring for a contraceptive diaphragm and made $50,000 selling that patent. By the standards of 1920s Denver, Haas was a tinkerer with a medical degree and a knack for solving practical problems. The problem that bothered him most was one he watched his wife deal with every month. The bulky Kotex pads, the belt, the discomfort, the constant worry about leakage. Haas knew there had to be a better approach. And he got the initial spark from a friend in California who mentioned that she used a small sea sponge inserted into the vagina to absorb menstrual flow. The concept was not new. Women across cultures had been using internal methods for centuries, but nobody had figured out how to manufacture one at scale. Haas started experimenting. He compressed strips of cotton into a tight cylindrical shape, attached a string to one end for removal, and then designed the piece that would define his invention. 2 telescoping cardboard tubes that functioned as an applicator. The woman would use the outer tube to position the tampon and the inner tube to push it into place. The entire process could be done without the woman's fingers ever touching the cotton or her own body. That design choice was not accidental. Haas understood the culture he was working in. In 1930s America, the idea of a woman inserting anything into her vagina with her bare hands was considered indecent by large portions of the medical establishment and the general public. The applicator was a medical solution wrapped around a social problem. It made the tampon functional and, just as importantly, it made the tampon acceptable to a society that could barely tolerate the existence of menstrual pads. On the 19th of November, 1931, Haas filed a patent for what he called a catamenial device, a term derived from the Greek word for monthly. On the 12th of September, 1933, he received U.S. patent number 1,926,900. He trademarked the product name Tampax, a combination of tampon and vaginal packs, and then he tried to sell it. Nobody wanted it. Haas approached Johnson & Johnson. They passed. He went to Kimberly-Clark, the company that had built its consumer business on Kotex pads. They passed too. The reasoning was consistent across every boardroom that turned him down. Internal menstrual products were too controversial. Women would not accept them. The market was not there. The moral objections would be too loud. Every single one of those companies would look back on that decision and regret it. On the 16th of October, 1933, Haas sold the patent and the Tampax trademark to a group of investors led by Gertrude Tenderich, a German immigrant and Denver businesswoman. The price was $32,000. Tenderich saw what the major corporations could not. She saw a product that offered women something pads never could: freedom of movement. Freedom from belts and bulky napkins. The ability to swim, dance, work a factory shift, or simply go about daily life without constantly managing a pad. Tenderich founded the Tampax Sales Corporation and started manufacturing the first commercial Tampax tampons herself, at home, using a sewing machine and the compression device Haas had built. The operation was tiny. One woman, one machine, one product that was about to change the lives of millions of people. The first Tampax ad ran under the headline, "Welcome this new day for womanhood," in the magazine American Weekly. It was cautious, clinical, and carefully vague, just like the Kotex ads before it. But the product underneath the euphemism was different. For the first time in commercial history, women had an internal option. Dancers and swimmers were among the earliest adopters, because for them the difference was not just convenience, it was the difference between being able to perform and not. By 1936, Tenderich had run out of capital to scale the business. She sold the Tampax Sales Corporation to Ellery Mann, who reorganized it as Tampax Incorporated and began building national distribution. The tampon was officially a real product, on real shelves, available to real customers. But a product being available and a product being accepted are two very different things. Because while Tampax was landing in stores, a fight was breaking out in doctors' offices and medical journals across the country. And the argument had nothing to do with safety, absorbency, or design. It was about whether a young woman who used a tampon could still call herself a virgin. In the 1930s and 1940s, male physicians across the United States published papers, gave lectures, and wrote opinion columns debating a single question: should women be allowed to use tampons? Not whether tampons were medically safe, not whether they were effective at managing menstrual flow, whether they were morally appropriate. The argument centered on three concerns, all of which had everything to do with controlling women's bodies and nothing to do with medicine. First, that inserting a tampon might break the hymen, which would mean a woman was no longer technically a virgin. Second, that the physical act of insertion could cause a woman to experience sexual pleasure. And third, that once a woman became accustomed to touching her own reproductive anatomy, it could lead to masturbation. These were not fringe opinions published in obscure journals. These were mainstream medical debates happening in the same decade that Tampax was trying to build a national customer base. Some physicians openly condemned tampons from their exam rooms. Others refused to recommend them to patients. The medical establishment was split, and the faction that opposed tampons was loud enough to shape public policy and advertising for decades. This is exactly why Earl Haas had designed the cardboard applicator in the first place. He understood that in the America he lived in, the idea of a woman using her fingers to insert a menstrual product was a deal-breaker. The applicator was his answer, a barrier between the woman's hand and her own body that made the product palatable to a society obsessed with female purity. He was not just solving an engineering problem. He was navigating a minefield of sexual politics that had been building since Leviticus. Tampax and other tampon companies had to fight this battle in their advertising. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, tampon ads included explicit reassurances aimed at nervous parents and young women. One brand, called Percettes, ran advertisements stating, "Of course, unmarried girls can use Percettes." Another brand, Meds, promoted their product in 1944 by highlighting applicators for daintiness, turning the act of not touching yourself into a selling point. A 1,965 Tampax educational pamphlet called From Fiction to Fact was specifically designed to address the virginity question for teenagers and their mothers. The forward-thinking physicians who embraced tampons pushed back against all of this. They pointed out that the hymen can be stretched or torn through exercise, horseback riding, or normal physical activity, and that its condition had never been a reliable indicator of sexual experience. They argued that managing menstruation was a health issue, not a moral one. But progress was slow. The cultural weight of centuries of menstrual shame does not lift because a handful of doctors publish a sensible paper. And this is the part of the story that tends to get left out entirely. While the tampon wars played out in white, middle-class medical offices and women's magazine advertisements, a black inventor named Mary Kenner was working on a different solution. In 1956, Kenner designed an adjustable sanitary belt with a built-in moisture-proof pocket that kept the pad secure without shifting or leaking. It was a genuine improvement over the clunky belted pads that millions of women were still using. She filed a patent. The patent was rejected. Not because the design was flawed, not because the market was saturated. A company that had initially expressed interest in manufacturing the product withdrew their offer after they discovered that Kenner was black. Her patent sat in limbo for 30 years. 3 decades of a better product that never reached the women who needed it because of racial discrimination. By the 1960s, tampons had finally gained enough mainstream acceptance that companies were competing on design rather than defending the product's right to exist. Applicators were refined. New absorbent materials like rayon were introduced alongside cotton. Tampon brands started advertising more boldly, though still without ever using the word period or showing anything that looked like actual blood. The industry was growing. Women were buying. The moral panic had faded into background noise. If you are finding this fascinating, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week. What came next was not a moral crisis. It was a medical one. And it started with a tampon that promised to absorb everything, including the worry. In the early 1970s, Procter & Gamble decided to enter the tampon market. This was not a small company experimenting with a side project. This was one of the largest consumer products corporations on the planet, and they wanted to dominate. Their approach was simple. Build the most absorbent tampon ever made. Make it so effective that women would never need to worry about leakage again. Then put it in the hands of every woman in America. They called it Rely. Unlike traditional tampons made from cotton or rayon, Rely was constructed from carboxymethylcellulose and compressed beads of polyester. These were synthetic materials borrowed from the food industry. Carboxymethylcellulose is a chemical compound typically used to thicken processed foods. Procter & Gamble repurposed it to create a tampon that could absorb nearly 20 times its own weight in fluid. When inserted, the tampon expanded into a cup-like shape that molded to the vaginal walls, creating a seal designed to eliminate leakage entirely. The marketing campaign leaned into this with a slogan that would age catastrophically. It even absorbs the worry. Procter & Gamble test-marketed Rely, in Rochester, New York, and Fort Wayne, Indiana, in 1974. Because the testing happened before 1976, the company was not required to submit safety results to the FDA. A grandfather clause in medical device regulations meant that Rely reached consumers without ever proving it was safe to use. After the initial test run, Procter & Gamble launched a mass sampling campaign that historian Shara Vostral estimates distributed 45 million sample packs of 4 tampons to women across the United States. 45 million, mailed directly to homes, unsolicited, across the entire country. By 1980, Rely had captured 20% of the American tampon market. Women loved it. It worked exactly as advertised. It absorbed more, it lasted longer, it leaked less. Procter & Gamble was winning. Then, women started dying. In January 1980, 12 cases of a mysterious illness were reported to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The patients were almost all young, previously healthy women. The symptoms came on suddenly: high fever, vomiting, diarrhea, a sunburn-like rash, and a rapid, dangerous drop in blood pressure. Some patients went into organ failure within days. The CDC began investigating and gave the condition a name: toxic shock syndrome. Over the following months, the case count climbed. The CDC assembled a toxic shock syndrome task force and launched 2 epidemiological studies to determine what was causing this outbreak. The findings pointed in one direction: tampon use. And within tampon use, one brand kept appearing disproportionately in the data: Rely. The science was not immediately clear, but what epidemiologists pieced together was alarming. The superabsorbent synthetic materials in Rely tampons were drying out the vaginal walls by absorbing not just menstrual fluid, but the vagina's natural moisture. When the tampon was removed, it left behind micro-ulcerations, tiny tears in the vaginal lining that gave bacteria a direct pathway into the bloodstream. If a woman happened to carry Staphylococcus aureus in her vaginal flora and lacked the specific antibodies to neutralize the toxin it produced, the result was toxic shock syndrome. Between 1,970 and 1,980, the CDC confirmed 941 cases of toxic shock syndrome. 928 of those cases were women. 905 occurred at the onset of menstruation. 73 women died. On the 22nd of September 1980, Procter & Gamble voluntarily recalled Rely from the market. The company entered a consent agreement with the FDA, agreeing to notify consumers and retrieve the product from stores. But the damage extended far beyond one brand. Because while Rely was the worst offender, the competitive pressure it had created had pushed every major tampon manufacturer to increase the absorbency of their own products. The entire industry had been racing toward the same cliff. After Rely was pulled, other manufacturers quietly began reducing the absorbency levels in their tampons. And there was another problem. At the time of the crisis, tampon boxes carried no standardized absorbency labeling. The CDC had recommended that women use the least absorbent tampon necessary, but there was no way for a consumer to actually compare absorbency across brands. Women were being told to make an informed choice with no information to base it on. In April 1982, a federal jury found Procter & Gamble liable for the death of a woman who had used Rely tampons and ordered the company to pay her husband $300,000 in damages. It was the first major legal reckoning for the tampon industry. It would not be the last. The toxic shock syndrome crisis did something that centuries of religious shame, moral panic, and medical gatekeeping had never managed to do. It forced the public to actually talk about tampons, not in euphemisms, not in whispers. In news broadcasts, congressional hearings, and courtroom testimony, the product that society had spent decades pretending did not exist was suddenly front-page news because it was killing people. The tampon industry survived. Barely. Sales plummeted in the early 1980s. Consumer trust collapsed. Manufacturers reformulated their products, reduced absorbency levels, and eventually adopted standardized labeling. The FDA tightened regulations. Warning labels about toxic shock syndrome began appearing on every box of tampons sold in America, and they are still there today. But the silence around menstruation itself was about to crack open in a way nobody expected. And it would start with a 21-year-old actress who needed rent money. In 1985, a young woman named Courtney Cox appeared in a 30-second television commercial for Tampax. She was not yet famous. She had no money, no steady work, and by her own account, she took the job because the contract paid enough for her to eat. The commercial itself was straightforward. Cox, wearing workout clothes, looked into the camera and explained how Tampax worked. And then she said a word that had never been spoken on American television before. It can actually change the way you feel about your period. Period. The actual word. On network television in the United States of America, in 1985, that was the first time. Not 1,955, not 1,965, 1,985. The same year, Back to the Future hit theaters and the first .com domain name was registered. American television finally allowed someone to say period out loud in a commercial for a product designed to manage periods. Cox later said she received fan mail for the commercial, not for a film, not for a television series, for a tampon ad where she said a word that half the population uses to describe something their body does every month. The fact that this was considered groundbreaking tells you everything about how deeply the silence had settled. And that silence did not suddenly disappear after 1985. It adapted. For the next 35 years, menstrual product advertisements on American and British television used blue liquid to demonstrate absorbency. Blue, like window cleaner, like dish soap, like anything other than the actual substance the product was designed to absorb. Advertisers treated menstrual blood as so offensive, so unwatchable, that they replaced it with a fluid that looked nothing like it. The message to viewers was clear. We will sell you this product, but we will not acknowledge what it is actually for. It was not until 2020 that Kotex became the first major brand to use red liquid in a pad commercial, 2020. The year of a global pandemic was also the year the advertising industry decided that blood could be red. The medical world had its own version of this denial. For decades, menstrual products were tested for absorbency using saline solution instead of blood. Saline is a clear, water-like liquid. Menstrual fluid is not. It contains blood, cervical mucus, and endometrial tissue, and it behaves differently from saline in terms of viscosity and absorption rate. This means that the absorbency ratings printed on tampon and pad packaging were based on how well the product absorbed a liquid that was nothing like the liquid it was designed to absorb. That testing standard was not updated until 2023. So where does the story stand now? The modern tampon has not changed dramatically since Earl Haas filed his patent in 1933. Cotton, a string, a cardboard or plastic applicator. The fundamentals are the same. Adhesive pads replaced the old belted designs in the 1970s, and they keep getting thinner and more absorbent, but the basic concept is still a descendant of the cellucotton pads that WWI nurses improvised on the Western Front. What has changed is the range of options. Menstrual cups, first patented by a woman named Leona Chalmers in the 1930s, have experienced a resurgence as reusable and environmentally sustainable alternatives to disposable products. Period underwear with built-in absorbent layers hit the mainstream market in the mid-2010s. Organic and biodegradable tampons now sit on shelves next to their conventional counterparts. The industry that nearly collapsed in 1980 has expanded into a global market worth billions of dollars, driven in part by the same sustainability concerns that are reshaping consumer products across the board. The conversation has changed too. Period poverty, the inability to afford menstrual products, is now recognized as a public health issue in dozens of countries. Scotland became the first nation in the world to make period products free in 2022. Several US states have eliminated the sales tax on tampons and pads. Schools and workplaces are beginning to stock menstrual products in restrooms the same way they stock toilet paper. Slowly, unevenly, The infrastructure of daily life is starting to treat menstruation as what it has always been: normal. This video started with a word, tapua, the Polynesian term for menstruation that gave every language on earth the word taboo. For thousands of years, women softened papyrus, rolled wool, folded paper, and tore strips of linen to manage something their bodies did every single month. They did it in silence, under threat of exile, shamed by religious texts, ignored by the men who wrote the history books, and told by their own doctors that managing their period with anything more than a rag was a moral failing. It took a world war, a rejected patent, a woman with a sewing machine, a corporate disaster that killed 73 people, and a 21-year-old actress who could not afford groceries to get the world to even say the word out loud. The product changed. The taboo is still catching up. If this is the kind of history you want more of, hit subscribe. We will see you in the next one.